Hey y'all, it's Kate from the Literary Apothecary, and welcome back to another episode of Bibliotherapy Sunday. So today we're going to do something a little bit different than our normal videos, and I'm going to be talking about some classic books for today's fantasy reader. So I was part of this really interesting conversation over on the Library of Alexandria's Discord server, which I'll link down in the description below. If you're not part of that, you need to join because it is so much fun. And I love Alan so much. He deserves all the credit. His videos are amazing. I'll also link his channel down below because he's just one of my closest booktube friends and amazing and deserves all the love. So anyways, back to our conversation. So some of the readers that I was talking with were talking about how they would like to read the classics but don't know really where to start because there's so many. And I jumped in and said, well, just start with the ones that are similar to the books that you enjoy reading now, today. Classics to me are those kinds of books that a lot of people, they aren't excited to read, but they say they want to read them. I think if you truly want to understand the evolution of literature and where certain ideas and tropes in today's books come from, then it's important to read some of the classics that have influenced today's literature. Obviously, you don't have to read every classic because not every classic will be for you and not every classic will be relevant to what you're looking to get out of it. So the books that I mentioned in this video today are books that I consider to be classics, but other booktubers may have other suggestions. The word classic is one of those words that means something different for every person. So Nico from Nico's Book Reviews, which I'll also link down below, and Aaron from the Discord both said that I needed to create this video for everyone to see because they were so interested in the conversation. So here I am creating it. Like I said, the books that I mentioned below are books that I consider as classics, but others will have different suggestions. So feel free to add your suggestions in the comments below. I'm going to start with 5 classics that I've read and then move on to 5 classics that I want to read, and then some honorable mentions at the end. So starting with the classics that I've read that have influence on modern fantasy books and writers today. The first is Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and also obviously the sequel, Through the Looking Glass. So the most obvious answer here as to how this is an early fantasy is just in the title, Wonderland. This is a fantasy land that Alice gets dropped into. She has to adjust to a life without laws, and also in Wonderland, she is the only person with self-control. There's also, you have talking animals. We've got the white rabbit who also wears a suit coat, and the caterpillar who smokes a hookah. And so these are some of the ways that this is a classic fantasy tale that influences today's fantasy books and fantasy themes. You get the magical travel, you get the talking animals, you get these like deeper conversations and deeper themes below the, kids level. You get the deeper below the kids fantasy fairy tale type of thing. And just like some of the other books we'll be talking about, it's one of those classic books that you have to read if you haven't read it. You can say, I've seen the movies, I know what it's about, but it's one thing to watch the movies and someone's interpretation of the original tale, and it's another thing to go and read the actual tale as it was meant to be read. Lewis Carroll is a master storyteller, and his writing in these 2 books is so glorious and so influential in today's modern fantasy tales that you have to read it. A lot of this stuff that I talked about here, I took from a really great article written by Leighton Carter, which is titled Which Way, the Fantastical Inversions of Alice in Wonderland, and I will link that down below in the description. Go check it out if you want more information on that. The next book to talk about We can't talk about classic influences on any kind of literature without mentioning the one and only William Shakespeare. So today I'm going to talk about Midsummer Night's Dream, which was one of my favorite plays by Shakespeare. You can basically just input any play Shakespeare's written into this conversation, but for me, the penultimate when thinking about fantasy is A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here you've got the obvious, you've got fairies and you've got magical juice, and there's also a human with a donkey's head. All classic fantasy elements. Then you get a deeper look into the world of fantasy with a Midsummer Night's Dream, which also shows the theme of highlighting the abuses of patriarchal control over female sovereignty, which you get in so much fantasy. Classic fantasy, modern fantasy, Disney tales, which we'll mention a little bit later. You get that throughout all of this fantasy. So in other words, what this abuses of patriarchal control means is that a male figure is determining what is reality and what is fantasy, what is a human's fantasy. And that's such a common trope throughout all of literature that I couldn't not mention A Midsummer Night's Dream in this conversation. The next classic up is Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. So when you're talking modern fantasy, you cannot mention this series, The Chronicles of Narnia. In this classic children's fantasy series, we get magical travel, talking animals, and magical battles to save the magical land of Narnia. Lots and lots of magic. And all themes that run through modern fantasy. And although C.S. Lewis claimed that there were no intentional Christian themes to his books, many can see Christian-based themes throughout this series, and some even believe that one character, no spoilers here, is meant to represent Jesus Christ. So to many, the Chronicles of Narnia are books that appeal to both children because of those fantastical, magical themes, and also dealt with that more mature Christian theme. In one way or another, these books have influenced so many fantasy writers, including Philip Pullman, who wrote his Dark Materials trilogy, another classic to be considered here. Catherine Patterson and the Bridge to Terabithia, another classic to be considered here. Lev Grossman and the Magicians, highly influenced by the Chronicles of Narnia. And even J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series, which, going back to the Magicians series, a lot of people describe the Magicians as a mashup between the Chronicles of Narnia and Harry Potter in a much darker and kind of more adult, more mature world. So that was the Chronicles of Narnia. Now our fourth classic that we're going to talk about is the Grimm fairy tales. If you have not read the original Grimm fairy tales yet and you are a fan of fantasy, you need to go do so now. These are tales written by the Grimm brothers, who were a pair of German brothers, and they're the grimmer, pun intended, darker origins of a lot of the classic Disney stories that a lot of us, myself included, grew up watching. In the Grimm brothers' adaptation of Cinderella, there's no fairy godmother that saves the day. The evil stepsisters cut off a toe and a heel, respectfully, to try to fit into the glass slipper, and then their eyes were pecked out by doves at the end. And I also recognize, I know some hardcore fans will say that's not the original fairy tale. I will recognize here that the Grimm brothers adapted the French tale by Charles Perrault into their fairy tale, but I couldn't mention influences on modern fantasy without the Grimm brothers, and can't talk about the Grimm brothers without talking about Cinderella. Some other tales that you might be familiar with: Rapunzel, Hansel and Gretel, and Sleeping Beauty, also known as Briar Rose in the Grimm fairy tales. So the Grimms believed that the most natural and pure forms of culture were linguistic and based in history. and the work of the brothers Grimm influenced other collectors, both inspiring to collect tales and leading them to similarly believe in a spirit of romantic nationalism, that the fairy tales of a country were particularly representative of it, to the neglect of cross-cultural influence. And so the Grimm fairy tales are hugely influential throughout literature, and you need to read them if you're a fan of any kind of literature. And then the last classic that I'll talk about that I've read is one of my favorite classics of all time, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker, the original vampire tale to influence all other vampire tales. If you haven't read Dracula, you need to go and do so. Yes, the movies are fantastic. I even loved the very short show with Jonathan Rhys-Meyers. I love everything about Dracula, but you cannot beat the original by Bram Stoker. It influenced so much, and it's so well written. I love it, and I go back to it all the time to read it. It's one of my favorite classics, and I recommend it whenever I'm talking about classics to anyone. So if you're a fan of vampire tales of any kind and you haven't read Dracula yet, you need to do that now. So now, quickly, I'm going to talk about 5 classics that I haven't read yet, but I really want to get to. Hopefully this year, maybe dragging into next year, depending on how my reading goes. And a lot of these are books that you're probably thinking of, why hasn't she mentioned this yet? You have to mention this. So the first is, of course, the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien, also The Hobbit by the same author. This has so much influence throughout all of modern fantasy today that you have to read The Lord of the Rings at least once. I am going to be reading it as part of a read-along with the Library of Alexandria's Discord coming up in March. If you want to join that, join us. The link is down below in the description. I can't wait to get into this. I read The Hobbit back in December, and I will link my review there for that book. But I can't wait to get to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because this is one of those books that I'm like, how have I not read these books yet? I'm 35 years old, and I haven't read them yet. And I love literature and reading, and I've read so much. I haven't read these books yet, but I can't wait to read it along with some of my friends in March. And I could do 10 different videos on the influence of Lord of the Rings on fantasy, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Another book that I hope to get to that has a lot of influence on fantasy today is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. A lot of modern, time travel bits in fantasy and sci-fi took their tropes and their influences from The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. The next is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. This is a book that I was supposed to read this month, but there's no way I'm going to get to it, so I've pushed it back to a later month. This was a buddy read on Andy Smith's Discord, which I'll also link below. And this is a classic Arthurian legend tale, and I love everything to do with the King Arthur legends and Merlin and Morgana and all of the Knights of the Round Table, and I can't wait to read this. But I took an entire class on Arthurian legend in college, and it was one of my favorite classes, so I can't wait to read this and see the influence throughout other Arthurian legend literature. Next up is the one and only Ursula Le Guin, and here I have the Earthsea Cycle, but just about anything by Ursula Le Guin can fit into this discussion. She's written short stories, she's written novels, she's written fantasy series, which is the Earthsea Cycle, and I can't wait to read all of her writing because I have heard such amazing things about her. And again, another author that I'm like, how have I not read her yet? I need to read her. So I'm hoping to fit that in later this year. If not, definitely early next year. And then the last author I have to talk about today, the last series that I'm going to talk about is The Eternal Champion Cycle by Michael Moorcock. And I don't really know anything about this series, but when I was looking up classic influences on modern fantasy, many people had mentioned this series and this author and said, aside from J.R.R. Tolkien, no other fantasy author has had more influence and has been read more by modern fantasy writers than Michael Moorcock. So I couldn't not include him in here, and reading all of that about his books and his writing and his influence has made me want to read him now. So I'm adding that to my probably 2022 TBR. I don't know that I'll be able to get to it this year, but we'll see. And then just really quickly, a couple notables that I have here, some honorable mentions. The Iliad. If you haven't read the Iliad and you love epic adventures and tales that are adventure driven and story driven, you need to read the Iliad. It's a really long book, but you can break it down into chunks, and that was also a read along, I believe, this month with Ellen and Andy at Andy Smith's Discord. Also, I can't mention fantasy influence without mentioning Gulliver's Travel by Jonathan Swift. If you don't know Gulliver's Travel, you need to go read that book. It is fantastic. And there's also been a great adaptation into movie with Jack Black. But I love Gulliver's Travel. It's one of my favorite classics, and it has a lot of underlying influences on modern fantasy. Next up is Charles Dickens, and a lot of people stay away from Dickens because he's can be very long-winded and he's very description heavy. So when I was reading The Eye of the World last month, and this month in December, it took me a long time to get through it, I was reminded a lot of Charles Dickens' writings. He's very detail-oriented, and holy cow, his characters are amazing. If you love character-driven stories and fantastic, memorable characters, you will love Charles Dickens' characters. It's worth to push through some of the long-winded sludge in his writing just to get to those characters. They are amazing characters. And then the last bit that I have to mention here is Stephen King. Now, this is debatable whether it's classic or not. Some people consider it classic, some people consider it more modern. To me, because I haven't read hardly any Stephen King, he's kind of like in that middle, but Stephen King diehards will consider him classics, and others will consider him more of a modern writer because he's still writing today. But I can't mention influences on modern fantasy books without mentioning Stephen King. So that is my book on classics that have influenced modern fantasy books. I can also do this on sci-fi and romance and all kinds of different genres if you want. Let me know what different genres you want me to do in the descriptions. Let me know what classic recommendations you have for modern fantasy readers in the comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you get notified on our next videos, and share with all your friends who want to read more classics. Don't forget, keep reading, and I love you all to the moon and back.